Welcome to the Chasing Tomorrow podcast. We have a amazingly sort of special episode today. When I started on this journey, I didn't start it alone. Over 3 years ago, I started with my buddy here, Dave Proctor, who's going to be on with me today. We came up with this silly idea that we should build this Chasing Tomorrow podcast. And for a year and a half, we did an episode every week. We watched Dave, get ready for his cross Canada record breaking run. We're with him along the way. And then, afterwards, Dave went into a healing process we'll talk about. And so we moved on from there. But now we're back together again. Dave's written his book, Untethered. It's an amazing book. You all should get it and read it and go on the journey with him. It's an amazing description of what it takes for a human to do what he did, but also then to recognize the implication of doing what he did and the sort of collateral issues that came from that. But it's also just an amazing, we all know, podcasters always have these great conversations before they get on with someone. But we were talking a little bit about, sort of the very human element of from phenomenal performance to life impact. And so we'll talk about that. I don't think we're going to get through everything in this one podcast. Dave and I are going to have to do this a couple times to sort of continue to dig in because I think there are some really deep meanings to this. Dave, welcome back. So great to have you. I'm just thrilled to be back on with you.
It's great hearing your voice, old friend. Yeah, great to be on again.
So, so it's just so much. It's almost hard to know where to start. But let's
hmm
start with the book because I think it's a good way to like. So you go off and you break this record, and I think that probably somewhere along the way, even though you never afforded yourself, you said, I'll get it done. I'm going to get this thing done. And then you have this really difficult time afterwards with physical healing and mental healing. And then you start to write the book in the middle of that. But tell me, like, how, when it towards the end, as you were finishing the run and knowing it was going to be done, like, how were you getting yourself ready for the next steps? Like, what was happening in your life at that moment?
Well, to be honest with you, Joe, there was just a complete elation at the end of this
Mm.
run. The last many days, probably even just the last day, because you don't allow yourself at all to feel like you can celebrate too soon or too
Yep.
early. So that last day was complete elation. I was in tears. I was laughing. I was having the time of my life because I was achieving my life goal of running across the country in record time. But you know, ultimately, I don't think you can plan. It's something like that. With the run across the country, the Transcon. You have to be so in it every day. You have to be so completely present and focused on what you're doing in the meantime, in that moment. That I know a lot of people, that including you, Joe, were saying, "Hey, you know what? You might have some dark days ahead after
Mhm.
you're done this. Either you're successful or unsuccessful, but
Right.
you might have some dark days." And I honestly couldn't even go there. It
Right.
was almost like, "Hey, what are you going to have for dinner next week? I don't know. I need to cook dinner for this week." And so, it's I had no idea. And in fact, I didn't even allow myself to go there of like, okay, what is life going to look like starting day one after I stopped this 67-day run across the country? So I had no idea. I
Mhm.
honestly had no idea. But I do know that, Joe, like the next many days, the next many weeks, they weren't really all that weird. It was this elation, this great feeling that you did something, but yet you still look in the mirror and you're still insecure. And okay, well, that's not changed.
Right.
But I think that ultimately, Joe, like sitting down and writing this book, starting about 6 or 8 weeks following the run, was kind of my glowing light. It was kind of my coming out of the darkness, just even for a short period of time, in order to maybe do something creative or storytell or tie the strings up and connect the dots between how you were feeling and really what kind of happened. I think the
Yeah.
book kind of saved me. Yeah.
Oh, for sure. And the reason I started here, for everyone listening, is not that we're not interested in the run, because
hmm
just to recap, it was 67 days, 67 miles a day across the second largest continent in the world, breaking a record that had been in place for many, many years.
hmm
But part of what I was sort of curious about is, when you read the book, you realize that there are a couple of times where you probably look at it and you cringe yourself. You're like, "Oh my god, I wasn't that nice to my brother,"
Oh yeah.
because I was feeling like so there's this after effect, of course, but then there's
Right.
this sort of reflection on if I'm going to perform at this level, I'm going to create a bunch of strain in every element, right? Myself
Yeah.
and on them. Like, did that feel as you were looking at some of that?
Yeah, looking back at the strain that I caused, not only unto myself, because hey, let's face it, I ran across, I don't know, 7/8 of the country with a broken foot. So that's
Right?
going to come back to haunt me later on. So there was, physical harm and psychological harm to myself, but I was also away from my kids for,
Yep.
the better part of 2.5 months. There was strain there. They
Yep.
missed their dad. I missed them. Crew members out there, mostly including my brother. He came on in Ottawa and then left in Thunder Bay, and that was the longest, kind of hardest section of the cross Canada run. And I've always thought that my brother he's always been there for me. Like he's my guy, and I want him out there for the hardest section. But I didn't even think that we would revert back to when I was 7 and he was 9 years old, and we were fighting over the basketball, or mom and dad's attention, or that it's ridiculous that I want this much avocado in that sandwich, or whatever. It was absolutely ridiculous, the things that we were fighting about.
Mhm.
And there's been real strain in those relationships. But Joe, I kind of wanted to write the book like completely honestly. I wanted to be completely honest, because I think that's kind of missing, and sometimes in these books like this. And it's one of the reasons why I love Andre Agassi's Open. It's a brilliant autobiography of his life, and he was just so open, and it's so I so love that. But yeah, the strains, and as I was writing the book, better understanding, because when you're starting to write about it and you're starting to make sense of things. And then I remember even that one part of the book where I ended up having a conversation with Terry Fox's brother, Fred
Right.
Fox.
Yep.
And Fred said, hey, that sounds exactly the way it was back in 1980 with me and my brother. And we ended up having this beautiful long conversation where we ended up like agreeing and be like, okay, what did you do in that situation? How did you feel thereafter? And he could end up getting, kind of making sense of how the runner would feel, and then I was making sense of how the crew would feel. And ultimately we dump our garbage where we feel the safest. And I was
Mhm.
dumping my garbage on my brother,
Yeah.
and he was not having it. He was reverting back to when he was 9 years old
Right.
and saying, Dave, you're ridiculous, you've been playing with this basketball for the last hour and a half, it's time to share.
Mm. I think it's just amazing though, right? So this microcosm of life that comes out in these moments of intensity, there's so many pieces of this. First, we all sort of don't carry as much of the impact of the early stage of our lives on the rest of our lives and our behavior. But boy, is there a direct line between them.
Sure is.
You found that out. The
Oh yeah.
second is that anytime we set out to do something big, I don't care if, someone wants to become a concert violinist or they want to run across Canada or you want to do whatever it is, you're going to make some impact on anyone else somewhat connected to you because of the amount of implication of that, right?
Yeah.
And how aligned are we in the support of each other to the achievements that they want versus
Right.
the how do they then feel because now they're not getting anything because they're all in this support. So
Hmm.
it's complex, right? So you did this microcosm in this short period of time, through all of these pieces, like, oh, yeah, implications. I'm not spending time with my kids. My brother and I are going back to 7 years old. I'm feeling all these issues, like,
Hmm.
and yet you still know that you have to push through this, right? Because
Yeah.
look, you set an objective and you're going to try and get that. A lot of complexity. It wasn't just running every day.
Yeah, and I think that's what people are circling back to that have read the book and circling back to me on social media. And all of you listeners out there, please reach out to me on Instagram or
Hmm.
Facebook Messenger or whatever, and tell me what you think. And I'd love to have a conversation with you about this book, because it's a lot of people are circling back and saying, like, that was a lot more complicated than I thought.
Mm,
on social media, and even you and I, Joe, when we were talking every week out there,
mm.
um, and broadcasting it on the Chasing Tomorrow podcast, we you know, there's a lot more happening than anybody thought, because
Right.
myself as a runner, you kind of suppress certain things, and you
Yeah.
compartmentalize, and I'll figure this out later, and I'll do these things, and make sense of things later. But you know the complexity was enormous, but yet I needed to kind of stay in my little microcosm, like looking through a small little barrel and seeing only what needs to be seen. And I think that stress really fell heavily upon Lana Ray,
Yeah.
and how she was managing the entire run, and all of the people, all the crew members, all of the meals, all of the motor vehicle things, hotels along the way. And she handled it like a complete champ. And even I was getting frustrated with her, I was getting upset, I was getting disappointed, or whatever it was, and she was still able to manage that, which is really truly incredible. It's they say that there is no self-made man, and I
Sure.
believe that.
Yeah.
Because behind every self-made man, or somebody who succeeds, is a whole village of people that were busy supporting that person. And I think you kind of get that in this book.
Yeah. Well, it is life, right? And
Yeah.
I think the interesting part about that is that you were on the edge throughout this process, whether it was a broken foot, being sick in the beginning, every other element of the strain put on your body. So if you had to carry much more burden, you probably
Hmm.
don't get it done. And so all that burden is shifting off of you because you now have very little variability in what more you could take on. There's like literally no
Right.
more. And so then the only place it can go, because it's got to go somewhere, is to the people supporting you. And in
Hmm.
that way, is sort of very predictable, but it is the same, it's the parent's dedication to a child in their life, right? That they're giving no room to themselves to be who they need to be because they're
Right.
in such a support mode for a child to develop. And so this idea of that sort of shared experience sometimes is all not that shared. It's actually somewhat, dominant on one side versus the other. And
Hmm. Hmm.
no other way to make that work, especially at this level, right, that you were at.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that it's interesting. Like both you and I, Joe, we've run numerous or many ultra marathons,
Mm,
and when you hang out with ultra marathoners, they're a different breed. It's a
mm,
different group of people, and they come to expect things from others, knowing very well what they've done themselves. And every one of my crew members that we flew in and flew out from different locations, they were all ultra runners,
mm,
except for my brother, right?
right.
And
Mhm,
so when I was being too bossy, or if I was being too demanding of whatever it was, they would get it because they've been there too. They understand that when you have no control or very little control over your environment, you hyper control the things you can control.
mm,
And my brother has never been there. He hasn't done these things. And
right.
so he didn't see me as an athlete or somebody who's doing something hard. He saw me as being an asshole brother who has taken the basketball for the last hour and a half and is unwilling to share. And he would say things about that. He would argue that point. And I tried to kind of coach him along the way out there, which was a terrible time to do that.
Yeah.
The timing was not right, but it was what it was. Still, he was an incredible crew member. He
Mm,
saw to my needs as he could, and but yet, he saw me as a different person. And I even said to him, I said, Dan, you know, I want you to imagine his favorite Major League Baseball player is Vladimir Guerrero Jr., who plays for the Toronto Blue Jays. And I said, imagine if Vladimir Guerrero Jr. asked you to be his helper for a day, during a Major League Baseball game, and I need a bottle of this mixed with this protein powder half an hour before the game. Hand it to me exactly 30 minutes before the game. I said, would you do it? And he's like, oh yeah, like that's the coolest thing. That's amazing. And I said, Dan, right now I'm Vladimir Guerrero Jr. Like
mhm,
that's how you have to see me. And he says, I see you as my brother. I
right.
see you as my brother, and I see you as being an asshole. And I said, you know what? Vladimir Guerrero Jr. might just hold out his hand half an hour before the game and not even look at you. And you would go over and hand it to him because
You know?
you see him as being, you know, an incredible baseball player, somebody that you admire. So I need you to pull away from that. And I need
Mm,
you to kind of see me as this, kind of disassociating from being a brother. And so we talked a lot about that, but we didn't ever come to resolve because
mm.
it's hard to do that, I think. I don't know if I could do it.
I don't know. Yeah, it's a really good question. I think
Mhm.
across the board, this idea of empathy, that can somewhat also be dispassionate at the same time, right? And,
Right. Right.
think about like, you know, been married for over 30 years, and my wife never really was out in the racing with me. She's like, I got a lot of other things going on. So, but when she has shown up at an ultra marathon as a crew, she's fantastic because she doesn't have like, oh, I feel bad for you. She's like, okay, this is what's going to happen, and I know you're okay carrying this load, you know.
Hmm.
And because she's watched me for 30 years and seen what other loads I've carried. And so she said it was sort of what normalized. But other people who have never seen that, they don't expect that from you in that
Right.
moment. And so then they're reacting to some other sort of standard that they might have. Your brother is you and your former relationship, so to speak. So it is interesting, if you're going to take someone with you on one of these journeys, whatever it might be, running across Canada, trying to be great at whatever we choose to do, pushing ourselves to new heights, having that, like, I think the abstraction from the book is there's a lot of really these really core life lessons that
Hmm.
kept showing up. So they're true, you
Yeah.
know,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. And that's what's beautiful about a run like this. So, and then of course, telling a story about it as well too, is it's basically life compressed.
Yeah,
It's
right.
all of
Mhm.
the turmoil, it's all of the dysfunction, it's all of the glory, it's all of the, you know, and that's one of the most beautiful things about ultra marathoning is you go for a 100-mile run. There's a lot of things that happen. It's
Yeah,
not just putting one foot in front of the other. There's a lot of mental barriers, physical barriers, emotional distress, doubt, desire for comfort, yeah, stoicism, on and so forth that take over. And I think that's one of the things that a lot of readers are liking about this book is that it just tells a life story, right? And so, but yeah, you're right. But circling back a little bit to kind of crew members, the relationships out there. You know, I remember the once I was reading this part about parts work. Asking a different part of you to show up, right?
right.
At different times, I'm a father, and at different times, I'm a professional working in a sports physiotherapy clinic, and then I'm a runner, and these are three very different people, and asking that person to show up in this time, because let's face it, myself as a father wouldn't be a good runner, and myself as a runner wouldn't be a good practitioner and or a partner, and so
Yeah,
you know ultimately too, the parts work comes along as well too when it comes to crewing and in support. Sometimes when Lana Ray's having a rough day at work, I have to ask myself for a different part of me to show up for her, right? And I think that's an interesting piece where you can kind of see yourself for where you are in the moment, but where you kind of need to be for other people and for yourself, and asking that person to show up. Is he wearing a
yeah.
cowboy hat? Is he wearing a cape? Is he wearing, nice work shoes? It changes, doesn't it?
I think so. When through my work career, there was a time when I became a CEO for the first time. There's a lot of pressure. You have all these people's lives you feel like depend on you.
Hmm.
Everything falls on your shoulders. And, I had stopped drinking alcohol, so I didn't have like a crutch
Hmm.
to go ride or run, but I still could show up as a jerk every once in a while. And so what I found I really worked hard on was when I felt I was like that, I would go home and say, "Hey, by the way, I think I'm in a really bad mood right now. So
Hmm.
anything I might say for the next hour, don't take personally. It has nothing to do with anyone. And because I'm just be an idiot, and it'll work its way out." And
Right.
so that context always helped
Yeah.
'cause then they were like, "Oh, yeah, he's complaining about the dishes in the sink,
Right.
but it's only because he's fussy, not because of that."
Yeah.
And that self-awareness and this understanding of what's going on, and we can relate that to people is a lesson of how to deal with these moments of intensity when some of that neurophysiology that's going on inside of us that we can't completely control at that moment,
Mhm.
if there's at least awareness about that,
Yeah.
then there's acceptance.
Yeah, yeah, and to that point, Joe, that's a great point. And I forget where I heard this the once, but it's basically that self-awareness and the openness to, be vulnerable and
Mm,
see. If you came home and you said, "Hey, honey, I'm exhausted. I've got all of this work that's on my plate, and I've got 30% for you.
yeah,
I
right.
got 30." Then that opens up an opportunity for your partner to say, "Hey, you know what? I got your 70. I
Yeah,
got you." You
right.
know? Um, and boy, she's just jazzed about showing up. And sometimes she comes to you and says, "Hey, I got 10%. I know we're hoping to go out for a date tonight, but can we just order pizza in or something?" And you're like, "Hey, I got your 90." But if
Yeah,
you end up both having 20%, if you got 20 and she's got 20, then you kind of figure it out, right? But at least you're open and honest. And I think that was really quite cool and key with the crew members out across Canada was, like right after I fell and hit my head in on the west side of Thunder Bay, and I was really quite concussed. Matt Shepard, he took 90. He was
he did.
like,
It was
"I got
amazing.
you."
I talked to him
Oh,
that day. I was like, "Whoa, man, that's unbelievable." Yeah, he's a pretty incredible guy, by the
oh,
way.
incredible dude. Absolutely. Absolutely.
He probably was the right person for that day.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, he's
Mhm.
yeah, he's an incredible human being. In fact, I think one day he's going to take a crack at this record. I think he's going to run across Canada, and I,
Wow.
I I just wish nothing but the best for him because he's an incredible human being.
Yeah. So this part of this whole story, we'll talk about, how you wrote about the aftermath, so to speak, in a
Mhm.
minute. But, you know, this is really interesting, right? The dynamic of human experience. I would say you were a rather aware guy before, right? You had had son with a rare disease. You had had some failed attempts. You were a world-class athlete living your life. So you had some challenge already.
Mhm.
Then you like amped it up like to another level. And one of the things you write about, which I'm not a scientist, I'm a reader and a practitioner, but this idea of human biology, and we'll call it the dopamine effect.
Mm, mhm.
And that in some sense, like we need to understand better these neuromodulators, neurotransmitters, whatever they are. There's ones like that help us go to sleep,
Right.
this GABA that gets produced later in the day. And if we're doing something to get in the way of that, we don't sleep. Is like there are things that are made for us to work. Like
Yeah.
dopamine was not meant to get Dave to run across the United States,
No.
right?
No.
This was to motivate you to go hunting when you had no food.
Exactly. Exactly. Or light a fire when you're just, freezing to death at night. 3,000 years ago. Yeah.
Right. But what someone told me once, which was the most amazing thing, is for as powerful as the brain is, it cannot control the neurotransmitters. They
Right.
work the way they work.
Yeah.
And so, talk a little bit about this dopamine effect and what it was doing, and then how that had this impact to you.
Yeah, and so what I've come to learn over the years, and probably reading a lot of the same books, and probably listening to a lot of the same scientists as you do, Joe, about dopamine, this neurotransmitter that's found in our brains and or in our bodies, and it is dumped into our system when we have chocolate, when we eat a square of chocolate, or when we smoke a cigarette, so nicotine, or even just your phone goes off and you notice that somebody's texting you that you're happy that somebody's connecting with you. That gives you a little dump of dopamine. And so it's this you body's motivation and reward system. And so ultimately thousands of years ago, we would be pretty motivated to go find a bush of berries in the woods. And let's face it, we really had to compete over limited resources. So we would have to work hard to go find those good things. But immediately after eating a whole bunch of berries from that bush, you feel good, like you feel really good when you're eating them. And then immediately there's this teeter-totter that takes place and you crash and we
Mm,
struggle. And as high as that high was with eating the berries, they say that's the a similar crash. We feel as
mhm.
terrible and they call it pain. And what does that do is it makes you motivated to go find another bush of berries, right? It makes you motivated to go. And that's really important. They did a number of studies out there where they made it so that mice had a constant amount of dopamine. And so they weren't motivated to go and eat or drink water. So they just starved to death. It's
Yeah,
incredible. Makes you go do things. And
right.
so my experience with running across the country was every province I was crossing over, I would
Mm,
feel an incredible amount of like I would feel so good. And my body
mhm,
was aching and sore, but yet I've never felt this good in my life ever.
mhm.
And I found that as far as for the further I went, the better I felt. It seemed like I even wrote in my book. I said it was almost like a doctor was coming and sneaking into my hotel room at night and injecting me with more of this feel good drug,
Yeah,
whatever this was. I'm not a drug user, so I'm not. I don't know what methamphetamines and cocaine feels like, but this was. I have to assume it's a lot like that or better.
yeah.
And I
Mhm.
was getting higher and higher and higher as I crossed the country. And then the moment you stop, right? Imagine if you took crystal
Boom.
meth or methamphetamines, that high followed by that low, they say one of two things either happens is you go and harm yourself, like commit
Right.
suicide because of that pain is that unreal, or
Yep.
you're desperate to go get more crystal meth. And that's the addictive cycle with dopamine. And so, I stopped running. And yeah, it didn't really come into effect right away, but it was weeks later. And I just started feeling, Joe, the best word I could use for it is I felt empty.
Yep.
There was nothing. And, I remember also in my journal, I wrote, I felt like I was in the basement and I just was so desperate to come up on the main floor and I would do anything. I would eat food. I would, I would seek out, anything to make myself feel better, but nothing felt like anything. And then I felt even emptier and I felt worse. And that was an incredible feeling. And I was still seeing my psychologist every week. I was
Yeah.
talking about it. But there was one day, Joe, where Yolanda was out of town, my kids weren't with me, and I don't know why, but I just felt this incredible sadness, like a loss, and it hurt so bad, and I've never dealt with depression in my life ever,
Mhm.
and I remember I pulled up in front of my house, and I have this, and I wrote about this in the book. I've got this
Yeah.
tire swing out in front of the house, and all I could think was, "Where's the ladder?"
Right.
And I'm a smart enough guy, Joe, to know what the hell are you thinking?
Right.
You've got a wonderful life, you've got great kids, but this pain, I just needed to escape it. I needed to get away somehow from this because I could run across the country, but I can't handle this.
Right.
And that was the moment that I ended up at the hospital and was seeking medical attention and getting drugs, antidepressants, in order to get the help. And it took a number of different drugs in order to find the right cocktail that
Mhm.
really supported me. But that was a really really rough year, and I feel like I'm out of it now. Like I feel good, no longer on any antidepressants. I'm feeling very 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 good. But boy, you're right, Joe. We can't underestimate the human condition. As
Mm.
much as we like to think, no, you know what? All my life I've pulled up my socks and I've gotten to work and I've put the work in and I do the hard things. This depression thing is just next level. I've never felt anything like it, and I certainly would not want to feel it ever again in my life.
No, of course not. Well, we're happy you made it through. I
Thank you.
think a piece that's interesting about this that happened, right? So we go through, your point of like, well, the high and the low, right? There's a
Hmm.
range that works.
Yeah.
It's like, I guess we'll talk about maybe a simple metaphor as a gas tank in the car. Like
Yeah.
you can go down to a quarter of a tank and fill it up to three quarters, and you're sort of good all the time. And it's a little bit different. There is more energy in the car with that more gas, but you went and you not emptied the tank. You actually went into the reserves and took out
Mm,
more.
right.
I
Right.
actually think that the replenishment wasn't just like pouring the gas back in, it was actually rebuilding the system that was
Mm,
going to replenish, which was why you hit that such a low. And there's not many ways that one could pull that much out of the system. But we've read about, the Michael Phelps and 17 gold medals was all of those years. He just literally wiped it all out. And then but life needs it, right? It needs that system to run. And so
yeah.
it
Yeah.
took a while. It's not going to be like, oh, you went for a 5 mile run. Well, that's right in the range, and that replaces itself in the normal process of the day.
Hmm.
It so depleted it, and there wasn't much way that you could change sort of the regeneration other than time, and
Yeah.
a lot of time,
Yeah.
because the system was really compromised. And so, but that, whether expected or not is real, right? It didn't even matter if you knew that was going to happen, it wouldn't have mattered because your behavior wasn't unpredictable. It was actually, you couldn't change it. It wouldn't matter what anyone explained to you what they could do. There was no system
Hmm.
that could respond. It's like a car with no gas can't move. That's it. You know,
Right. Right.
and you
Well,
had,
yeah, yeah, absolutely, Joe. And to further to that, like I look at my behavior now and the things that I said, the things that I've done, the relationships that might, never be okay again because of my behavior. None of it makes sense,
mm,
you know. But also that person, Joe, who's breaks into your house to steal items, to go get drugs. We all know what's right and wrong. We all
mm,
know what's socially acceptable. But yet, when you're in that state, you know, chips are on the off the table. Like you don't care. You will do anything in order to feel something. And I now in my life, Joe, I'm busy apologizing
mm,
and begging for forgiveness because I've got some good friends that I've harmed along the way by 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 being in the state that I was in. But I think that to your point, like you know when it comes to regulation of your body, when it comes to those systems, we take them for granted when they're working, but when they're not working, I feel that we all could be doing a lot better of a job to be supporting those people going through something. When somebody's acting completely irrational, there is no way that they can act rational in that
right.
state.
Yeah.
And and I think that was one of the reasons why I was so very honest in that last chapter of the book was,
Mm,
you know, I I read a lot of these books about these journeys. I wrote the book that I would want to read,
yeah.
and I don't see anybody else kind of. I know that they're struggling, but I don't see anybody else talking about it. But if you can write a book and then have it's hey, it's all in the pages there. And you even see at the beginning of every day it says exactly how far I ran and how consistent I was with the 12 and a half to 13 hours. Like it was very, very consistent every day, and that's strong. That's strength. If somebody wants to debate with me, I'd love to have that debate. I was a very strong person that summer,
Yeah.
but but then to say, well, that person's just weak. That's why they succumb to, depression, or that's why they succumb to poor behavior. That's not fair. I'm not a weak person, but it was a complete overhaul on the regulatory system. And I thank God for the people in my life that gave me patience and expressed love in that time period.
Yeah, maybe that word is just ill put in context of the circumstance.
Right,
You know,
right.
to say weak, that's, I don't know, the person with the broken leg saying they're weak because they can't run a mile is sort of a bit stupid. It's the wrong word. I mean, it's like,
Yeah.
we often are incapable on ourselves of either understanding or connecting. Maybe
Hmm.
we're weak ourselves because we're or afraid of that moment, and what could I say? And
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, I think that you know, and for anyone who, endeavors to read the book, and I said to Dave, there's this sort of monotone kind of thing to each day, right? And that's happening, and there's these nice nuggets, and it's fun. And you feel like you go on the journey, and you get to the end, and you're like, oh, whoa! So you just have to sort of be a little ready for it because
Hmm.
it is the reality of what was created. And I think, Dave, not from just this run, right? Like you had tried to do this run before,
Yeah.
you know,
4 years before. Yeah.
tried. You and I were together every day, kind of thing. Like, even remember the other run you were trying to do in Canada, that 300-mile run,
Yeah.
and you had these issues, and so there was a lot building up. I mean, this
Hmm.
was not just 67 days. This was the
Right.
year of it culminating, and I'm glad it culminated in the success, because in some way it was a redemption of sorts.
Right. Right.
This last piece was going to need to be resolved anyway. It was a
Yeah.
hard way to go through it, but it's just as a friend from a distance feeling like, and so for you to tell everyone that is that any of us who are struggling, sometimes you just have to go through that to get to the other side. It doesn't go away ever until you
Oh,
resolve.
yeah. Yeah. And that's my experience too, is that, sometimes you just got to sit with it. You got to sit in the crevasses of the pits of hell.
Yeah.
Sometimes they come and you just have to take them straight on.
Mhm.
And it's not easy, but life isn't easy sometimes. And sometimes you've got to do the hard work. And it was tough. It was a really rough year. But
Oh, like writing that part, did you cry while you were writing it? Did it make you feel terrible? Did it make you feel good? How did it feel writing the aftermath?
you know, I, I feel that writing this book was probably the perfect healing for me. You know,
Mm,
I not only just the aftermath, but even during the run, it was hard to kind of explain that, all of the little pieces that kind of came together. And then when you end up, connecting the dots and putting the strings together, and you're like, oh, okay, that's why I was kind of feeling that. And then that's
yeah.
why I had success with that approach. And
Mhm.
so ultimately throughout the entire book, and it was all this, positive reinforcement that, okay, great. I'm doing the right thing because I'm feeling good while writing this book. And in fact, at times, it was the only time that I did feel good
Mm,
was,
okay.
that I would stay up late and write. I was consistent with the writing, and I'm a terrible writer. I'm a hunt and peck method writer. I don't know how to do this. So it took a long time. It took a full
Yeah.
11 months to write this book. But, at the final chapter, when starting to write about it, it was, you know, I, I had a fork in the road. And, I could either go here or I could go there. And it almost seemed like it wasn't even an option. I had to be honest. I wasn't going to be honest all throughout this book and then just toss it out the window and say, well, you know what? I've been taught as a young man that, we don't talk about our feelings. And so, no,
Right.
that's not, I think that, I think that this is maybe a book for men, for young men,
Mhm.
where you're like, no, when the shit hits the fan, we can talk about it, you know, and there's no shame, there's no feeling, bad about how you feel or that somebody's judging you. It's just this is this. So when writing it, I felt really empowered. I felt that it kind of made sense, and I was kind of putting a bow
Mm,
on this. And oddly enough, as I was finishing the writing, that's kind of when my depression kind of lifted.
yeah.
I started feeling good. I started feeling motivated to go do things. I started feeling balanced. I remember my kids would say something and I didn't snap. And I was like, oh, okay, something's different. Like I'm not feeling limbic anymore
Yeah.
or as limbic. And so I feel that sometimes, you know, kind of opening up and showing that open vulnerability maybe sometimes is that last final key piece to passage And I feel that that was the case for me.
Yeah. There's Maslow's hierarchy, and who knows it as this top of it, it's called self-actualization.
Hmm.
And then Joseph Campbell writes about transcendence, and so do the Buddhists.
Hmm.
Words and these ideas just they're very difficult to connect to because we don't know what they mean. Like, what does
Right.
that really mean? And when I started off my life, didn't have much like you. We go through and we push ourselves to some limits and we keep doing it until, and I was finishing the Tahoe 200 and the last 25 miles took me 25 hours because my ankle was so bad I couldn't even walk. And I get near the finish line and I just burst out crying, like just completely
Mm.
unexpected. Why? And, on reflection, I finally realized that this self actualization, which I think is part of what you went through, was you finally fall in love with yourself and you forgive yourself for all the ways that you felt about your sort of insecurities in your life. We're just working so hard to prove to ourselves, forget anyone else, just
Hmm.
ourselves that we're worthy of being here in that we've overcome whatever that starting point was where we didn't feel that, no matter
Yeah.
whether we were loved or not. I'm not even talking about whether you had parental love you or I'm not picking on a person, just generally, this is about the internal of this system. And sometimes, maybe you can get there through meditation, you can get there through other methods.
Yeah.
But in some sense, to me, and the reason why the healing really started to happen was you then were in the same state that I was, which is like, okay, like, I actually really, really ripped myself in half and I put myself back together again, and I'm happy with what this is and what I will
Hmm.
do the rest of my life. And I think that we need a better path there, Dave, than, having to do some of the things we've done, but it's representative of the challenge that we have in life.
Yeah. And I think sometimes I feel like you have to kind of go to the end of your rope
Mm,
to then come to the understanding that, maybe some of the things that we've been taught, maybe some of the things that we have tended to believe are, maybe not really the right way. Maybe sometimes, at least for me personally, writing this book was a gift. And being able to, put it down on paper and now it's a published book on Amazon, I've taken off that cloak where I was
right.
kind of hiding. And I don't know about you, but, hiding from, your feelings, your thoughts, your ideas, your secrecy, what you're ashamed of. I don't know. I don't see a lot of people being able to hide and still, kind of getting through and over something. They're now in their 80s and they're still hiding. They're still
Yeah.
cloaked. And I feel that that was the case with this book. It's very public. It's very. I've gotten so many people saying, "Oh my God, Dave, I can't believe that you went there." And I'm like, "Well, why not?
I didn't
Why
why
not?"
not? I think that there's this obligation, right? There's an obligation to start to talk about what life is and how it works,
Yeah,
and that we're creating in a world where, I use social media, but I think that there's a world where we exacerbate the problem of this insecurity no matter what level, like,
yeah,
literally, there is no enough,
yeah,
right? And so that's that's not how this system works, and so
yeah,
if we keep pushing on that, all we're gonna do is break it. Like, this acknowledgement of how we are and who we are matters, and so I think actually, since you experienced it, you actually almost have an obligation to tell everyone and to tell it again and again because it's real, and you're like, "Hey, look, I got this world record at a level that, is almost unimaginable," and yet, what I really learned was not that I could run across Canada in 67 days. What I learned was I could find my way through to a better place on the other side of this.
yeah. And I agree, and I think that, yeah, we have an obligation because I think that we're all kind of going through the same thing. We're all, on
Mhm.
this globe that's, orbiting the Earth, and we're all living a very very similar experience, just, different shapes and sizes. And we all deal with loss. We all deal with, gratitude. We all deal with triumph. We all deal with frustration and anger. And yeah, mine just looks like it looks like something a little bit different.
Mm,
But yet, I think that, and I really hope that, if somebody reads the book and takes a little bit from it, it's that, what, and hey, I'll fast forward a little bit. I'll tell you, Joe, that the messages that I've received from everybody, I haven't received one bad one. And the
no.
fact is when you open up and you are vulnerable and open with others, that's the greatest gift that you can give, because I think then ultimately people then it tells them that, hey, you know what, I could maybe feel like that too, or I could, tell my mother really how truly how I feel, or I could, call my kids, or I could, do whatever that is.
Mm,
You could end up getting somewhere that's worthwhile.
yeah. You know, there's two things that are sort of cute because they fight against like in the middle of I was told this recently when I was doing a 100-mile race in the middle. It says you need to say out loud, "I feel fantastic" when you feel terrible, and then when you feel
Mm,
wow, is that hard to say?
yeah, yeah,
It doesn't matter that it's these 3 words, it's just actually, like, you fight against saying it,
yeah, yeah. Oh yeah.
and so there's this we keep talking about biology, we'll get a scientist to tell us what we're really talking about one day, Dave, but then the same thing with saying, "I'm sorry," which is what you did in a sense with describing this situation,
Hmm.
but if in a human dialogue, anytime you ever say you're sorry, I've never found anyone who doesn't sort of immediately accept
Yeah, yeah,
because we really do have empathy for each other. It's when we fight against that, when we're not vulnerable, when we don't say we're sorry, when we can't do the things that seemingly get us to the side is when we struggle. And I think that that is what
yeah.
you did there. And that's why you're going to just keep getting great feedback.
Yeah, and I think that too, like going back to, about when you're running and you're like, I'm doing great here. There's a saying that I say when I'm running and people, hey, how are you doing? Well, I'm getting better. You know, that's not true. But you know what? It's the funniest thing. Even though you say it, you put it out into the universe, you, you kind of feel a little bit better. I
Yep.
don't know what it is.
Mm,
If somebody said, "Hey, how are you doing today?" "Oh, I'm having a terrible day." Well, yeah, but hey, you know what? It's going up from here. I just had a really tough meeting, and but I'm sure that the next meeting, or hey, I'm talking to Joe next, so I'm going to have a good conversation. You can end up you manifest destiny like that, and so yeah, I think that you put things out into the world, and then that's ultimately what you get back.
yeah. What I like also is that you're avoiding, of course, always our last question in Chasing Tomorrow is what's next. But what you've been avoiding, which is in a good way, avoiding is trying to resolve for what happened with like all of a sudden a new big goal. Like that's like
Mm,
sort of avoid what happened.
mhm.
Oh, I'm gonna go, break a record when we used to talk about run across Russia, like
Right,
that's
right.
avoiding really going through what you had to go through. And you say, hey,
Hmm.
yeah, I went running and yeah, it didn't really help.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah.
Didn't solve like so yeah, in this resolution stage, there's a lot to it, right? I mean, you had to try a lot of techniques and give yourself time because that it just took a while to refill.
Oh, it absolutely did. Yeah, it absolutely did. And you know what? Some might even argue that it's still happening. I
Yeah.
ended up running a race back in, what was it, about 4 or 5 months ago, and it was a 200-mile race, and I dropped out at 120 miles
Yeah.
because I was not having fun. The entire 120 miles I'm out there, I'm like, what am I doing? Like, and you know how it is, Joe. You've been running for years, where you have this fire in you. There's a purpose. There's a reason to being there.
Yeah.
The entire 120 miles, there was no real purpose and reason. There was a guy right on my tail, and I was kind of rooting for him. I wanted him to because he's a great guy. And I was like, well, if I just walked off the course, he's free and clear to go and have a great race and a better race placing. And so I don't know. I lack the fire, and I don't know if
Mm,
it'll come back. I've signed up for a bunch of races next year, and
mm,
I don't know. But all I know is that life is constantly evolving.
mm.
What you want in life and in is always shifting. Who knows? Who knows where I'm going to be in the next little while? But I also know that you got to be relatively patient.
Yeah.
and give yourself, some space to feel the feelings, and to allow for those desires and wants to come, organically. And I feel like I'm doing that, and I feel like I'm doing that simply because I went through this process over the last now year and a half, and I feel like I'm a lot more complete of a human being.
Yeah, maybe, well, we're going to talk a couple more times on this podcast because we'll go deeper on a couple ideas. But we there's a couple questions we like always give to people, really, if you want to push them hard. Like,
Hmm.
what's your purpose? Who are you? What do you want your legacy to be? And they're not easy to answer because they're complicated and they need a
Hmm.
lot to resolve. And I think the good thing is that you're on the way to figuring out the answer to those questions.
Yeah.
Your purpose is evolving. Your
Yeah.
purpose is evolving, and so is sort of what that legacy might be. And it can't just be this one dimension. And
No.
who is Dave Proctor is a complicated question. But the good news is that you have a whole set of experiences to help you sort of frame that going forward.
Absolutely. Yeah. And Joe, kind of back to that parts work, that we were talking about
Mm,
is, you, Joe, and all you listeners out there, imagine yourself as being many different people all within yourself. Like you have, that badass runner who's a tough son of a gun, right? And he might be wearing a backwards baseball cap and, grit, and and mud on his face because he's been running all day. But then you have the compassionate care worker when it comes to having an elderly parent, you know
mhm,
the very patient person who's, let's say your mother has Alzheimer's. You might have that other part of you who's a parent or a worker or whatever it is, and asking those people to show up at different times in your life. But I guess, when it comes to, like, what's your purpose, I think it evolves. For me, it personally, it's evolved every 5 or 10 years, and I feel like I'm coming into a place where, you know I feel like I'm a leader. I feel like there's this new person that's arriving in my life, and this new person, is wearing a sport jacket, and, like, I'm somebody that's going to be, supporting people, and bringing upon my life experience, and supporting people through, getting somewhere where they want to go, because I've gone there when it comes
right.
to running and athletics. But that person starts to come in, and that person wrote the book.
Yep,
That person is supporting people and runners, and, kind of just anybody who wants betterment within their life, which should include all of us, I think. And I'm there passing along what has worked for me, things that I take for granted that other people don't know, in order for them to go and kick some doors down in life. And
yeah,
I think that's my parts work that I'm doing for myself. And I challenge everybody who's listening to this podcast is, you know, write it down. What kind of parts? Who are you? And that person that's at work isn't the same person that's at home playing with the kids.
right.
There's two different people. What do they look like? How do they stand? Well, like, what kind of posture do they have? What kind of attitudes do they have? But is there another part of you that sometimes needs to come out? And I think that future purpose involves either furthering that one part that's already there, or developing another part of you.
Yeah, I think that, the good news, first, I agree. I think we'll all benefit from that. You know, to be able to say, "Hey, look, I've been through it and I've gotten to the other side and it's okay. We can get through there together," is also really
Mm,
valuable to a lot of people who, for their own reason, are going to go through some kind of similar, hero's journey. Dave, I think, well, one, congrats on the finish. Of course, I'm glad that you broke the record, and
thank you.
it's an effort of, such grand proportion, we'll never sort of really connect with it. But for all of that, I think more of a thanks is that you went and put some time into sort of telling the aftermath, meaning that, we all have some struggles to work through, and we're going to find a pathway there because it's good for all of us to do that. And now on to the next chapter, the next book, the next whatever, this chase tomorrow that we started over 3 years ago still applies, because if we lean into the future, we should do so with a positive attitude. And just thrilled to be back on with you. I think we'll keep you as a regular guest here so we tell some more stories about what's happening. Interestingly enough, there's a lot of layers to this. So, well,
There always has to be, right? The bigger the cake, the more the layers. It was a pretty big cake.
yeah,
Yeah,
amen to that. Yeah.
yeah.
Well, Dave, thanks very much. Look forward to talking and watching, great amount of book sales. Go to Amazon.com and buy Dave's book, Untethered, Dave Proctor, just so you guys find it. You'll love it. And let's give him 5-star reviews all the time. And yeah, do reach out to him on Instagram, etc. He's a very accessible guy and we want to support him. So thanks, Dave.
Thanks a lot, Joe. We'll talk soon.